Be leaving Washington with a deal on tariffs?
I think they're going to be very happy. We have a lot of things that we're working on that people don't talk about. They talk about, competitiveness. She's a very competitive person. And they talk about things that we don't necessarily agree on. But I think they're going to walk away very happy. I think so.
In Washington, the cameras caught a familiar scene: the handshake, the smiles, the flags. But what surprised everyone wasn't the setting, it was the mood. For months, relations between Canada and the United States had been tense, defined by tariffs and frustration. Yet this time, President Donald Trump looked relaxed. He spoke warmly about Canada and hinted that something positive was coming. Beside him, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with calm confidence. He reminded Americans that Canada is their second-largest trading partner and their biggest foreign investor. The message was clear. Canada is not a junior partner, it is an essential pillar of North America's economy. Trump predicted that Canada would be happy. Carney called the two countries stronger together. Behind those short remarks was a bigger story, a subtle shift in power. What began as a trade war built on pressure and threats is now turning into a lesson in patience, leverage, and quiet strategy.
There are areas, as the President just said, where conflict, maybe not so much conflict, we compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
Carney did not come to Washington to plead for relief. He came to remind the U.S. how deeply the two economies are connected. Canada is the second-largest trading partner of the United States and its largest foreign investor. In the past 5 years alone, Canadian businesses invested over $500 billion south of the border. And if stability returns, that figure could multiply in the next decade. Every major U.S. industry depends on Canadian inputs. Aluminum from Quebec powers aircraft parts in Ohio. Steel from Ontario frames cars in Michigan. Electricity from Canada keeps factories running in New York and Minnesota. Carney tied every number to a shared benefit, making clear that what hurts Canada also hurts American industry. Across the Great Lakes states, governors have echoed that point. Their regional economies depend on cross-border manufacturing and energy trade worth more than $60 billion each year. Many have urged the White House to ease tariffs because local factories cannot absorb higher costs. That frustration gave Carney proof that Trump's tariffs were backfiring inside the U.S. itself. Rather than confront Trump directly, Carney used calm, data, and tone. He spoke about deals that work for both nations, focusing on competitiveness, not conflict. It was a message Trump understood. Kellyanne Shaw, the former White House trade advisor, later said Carney was building natural chemistry. But in truth, it was strategy. Carney knew that Trump values personal rapport as much as policy. That diplomacy began to pay off. For the first time since the tariff conflict began, Trump described Canada as a valued partner instead of a trade problem. The change was small but meaningful. Trump's tone changed because his policy is hitting its own limits. When he launched tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, he aimed to punish trade partners and boost U.S. production. Instead, costs climbed and business confidence weakened. Canada's role in that equation is critical. U.S. automakers source up to 40% of their parts from Canadian plants. When tariffs raised material costs, production in Michigan and Ohio slowed. Construction firms reported higher prices for aluminum and lumber. Even cabinet and furniture makers, once supportive of tariffs, warned they could face price increases of up to 20% by early 2026. The tariffs meant to protect American jobs are now threatening them. That reality forced Trump to soften his language. In front of cameras, he spoke warmly about Canada and hinted at something positive to come. His America First rhetoric suddenly carried a note of cooperation. The White House needed that shift. The administration was already dealing with a budget stalemate and rising inflation. Alienating Canada further risked cutting off supply chains that feed American factories. Governors from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota have warned that continuing tariffs could lead to layoffs before the Christmas quarter. In this environment, Carney's composure worked. His visit gave Trump a moment of stability and diplomacy, while Washington looked divided. Both leaders left with political cover, but Canada left stronger. There were no new tariffs, no escalation, and for once, restraint from a president who thrives on confrontation.
My takeaway from this bilateral meeting was very much an American first tone as well as a Canada first tone coming out from both leaders saying, look, we have a really important relationship, one of the largest trading relationships in the world. We are the closest of allies and friends, but we are also competitors when it comes to some of these key sectors. And I think the relationship between nation states is complicated, and both of those things can be true at the same time.
The real gain from the October meeting was not a signed deal, but a new tone. Carney secured a technical channel for ongoing talks on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. In trade diplomacy, keeping that dialogue alive means influence. It gives Canada a voice before the 2026 USMCA review even begins. While Trump seeks short-term victories abroad, Carney is playing the long game. He suspended the digital services tax and scaled back counter tariffs before the visit. Small moves that reopened communication. For investors, that stability has already shown results. The Toronto Stock Exchange rose modestly after the trip, driven by industrial and energy shares tied to U.S. trade. Domestically, Carney gained breathing room. His critics at home had accused him of failing to deliver results. After the meeting, Trump himself praised his negotiating skills, which strengthened Carney's credibility. He now appears steady and patient, guiding Canada through turbulence without confrontation. Beyond Washington, Canada is building influence through its provinces. The premiers of Ontario and Quebec continue working with U.S. governors in the Great Lakes region, forming a cross-border coalition of economic allies. These local ties, built through decades of trade and shared industries, have become Canada's quiet power base. They give Ottawa indirect sway inside the U.S. political system, bypassing the volatility of federal politics. The October visit therefore marks the start of a new phase, one where Canada negotiates from endurance, not desperation. Trump's tariffs were meant to show American dominance, but they revealed America's dependence. The more Washington raised barriers, the more U.S. businesses felt the pain. Prices climbed, governors protested, and pressure for cooperation grew. For Canada, this is a quiet victory. It did not come through confrontation or slogans, but through persistence. Carney turned a hostile policy into a reminder that the prosperity of both countries is intertwined. He avoided escalation, kept economic dialogue alive, and positioned Canada ahead of the next trade review. The meeting ended without signatures, but it changed the story. The world saw a U.S. president softening his stance and a Canadian leader who refused to bow yet earned respect. In diplomacy, that shift matters more than any paper deal. Trump once tried to make Canada bend. Instead, he gave Ottawa the leverage it needed to rise.
After months of back and forth, the U.S. and Canada appear to be making progress toward a trade deal.
There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
In Washington, the mood was serious. Cameras caught Prime Minister Mark Carney walking up the steps of the White House, returning for his second high-stakes meeting with President Donald Trump. It wasn't a routine visit. It was a test.
It was a conversation broached by the Prime Minister about the Keystone XL pipeline, which is a pipeline many Canadians are probably familiar with.
Carney had come to talk trade, but what surprised observers was the card he placed on the table. In the middle of a tense conversation over tariffs, he raised the prospect of reviving the long-dead Keystone XL pipeline, a project once buried under years of political battles in both countries. The move caught attention because Keystone is not just a pipeline. It represents the push and pull between two economic visions: Trump's drive for energy dominance and Carney's attempt to secure relief from punishing tariffs. Canada is still facing a 50% duty on its steel and aluminum, a measure Trump believes will make America stronger. Yet behind the symbolism of that handshake in the Oval Office lies a different reality. Those same tariffs are now starting to weaken the very supply chains that keep North American industries alive. By putting Keystone back into the discussion, Carney reframed the entire relationship. He wasn't asking for favors. He was reminding Washington that energy security in the United States still depends on Canadian cooperation. Trump's trade playbook relies on one simple idea: economic pressure brings results. His administration has used sweeping tariffs since early 2025, including the 10% blanket tax on most imports and a 50% tariff on Canadian metals. The goal was to drive production back to U.S. factories and force trading partners to concede better terms. But as months passed, that strategy began to turn inward. Reports from the Wharton budget model in April showed rising input costs across American manufacturing centers. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio, both dependent on Canadian aluminum and steel, were paying up to 18% more for raw materials than a year earlier. Construction companies in Pennsylvania complained about shortages that delayed projects and raised prices. At the same time, energy firms found themselves caught in another bind. U.S. refineries rely heavily on the heavy crude that comes from Alberta. Without it, they have to import from faraway suppliers in Venezuela or the Middle East. Transportation costs alone make that crude 20 to 25% more expensive, according to data compiled by the U.S. Energy Information Administration in mid-2025. Carney's team understood this dynamic. Instead of confronting Trump directly, they introduced an option that could solve both sides' problems: expand access to Canadian oil in exchange for a more balanced tariff framework. The idea wasn't a public demand, it was leverage. If Washington wants a stable energy stream, it must treat Canada as an equal partner. That shift in tone changed the equation. Trump's tariffs were meant to squeeze Canada, but by autumn 2025, the strain was landing squarely on U.S. consumers and industries. The more Washington tried to pressure its neighbor, the more it exposed its own dependence.
Donald Trump brought it back in his first iteration as president and still likes it. As recently as last spring, was talking about wanting to get it going again. Mark Carney obviously put this on the table for the president as an idea. The president, we're told, was receptive to it.
To understand the weight of Carney's proposal, it helps to recall what Keystone means in the history of North American politics. The pipeline has been debated for over 15 years, spanning 4 U.S. presidencies. It was canceled by Barack Obama over environmental concerns, revived by Donald Trump during his first term, and canceled again by Joe Biden on his first day in office. By October 2025, most believed Keystone was gone for good. Even its original developer, TC Energy, had walked away. But Carney brought it back into the conversation, not as a construction plan, but as a signal. It reminded the White House that Canada's energy resources are not just commodities, they are part of a shared infrastructure that powers both economies. Reviving the pipeline would allow the U.S. to replace expensive foreign imports with oil from a trusted neighbor. It would also ease political pressure in Alberta, where provincial leaders have long pushed for a route that bypasses British Columbia's environmental resistance. For Carney, the mention of Keystone solved multiple problems at once. It offered economic logic, domestic symbolism, and a subtle diplomatic challenge. If Trump accepted, he could claim a win for American energy independence. If he refused, he would have to explain why the U.S. preferred unstable foreign suppliers over secure Canadian flows. In that sense, Carney had turned a controversial project into a quiet test of leadership. Reports from Ottawa later confirmed that the U.S. president was receptive to the idea. No promises were made, but the discussion itself shifted the balance of power. For the first time since Trump reimposed tariffs, Canada had something the U.S. wanted badly enough to keep the talks going. Back in Washington, the optics looked familiar: a handshake, some laughter, and talk of progress. But beneath the surface, the trade dynamic had changed. Trump's tariffs were supposed to prove that America could dictate terms. Instead, they exposed the limits of unilateral power. Throughout 2025, U.S. trade data painted a sobering picture. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that American exports fell by 3.4% in the second quarter, largely because of retaliatory measures and higher input costs. Domestic manufacturing output slowed, while consumer prices rose in sectors dependent on imported materials. What began as a show of strength was turning into a feedback loop of higher costs and diplomatic friction. For Trump, the political calculus is shifting too. Midwestern governors and industry groups, once loyal allies, are calling for targeted tariff relief, especially on Canadian goods. They argue that the tariffs are no longer protecting jobs but threatening them. Carney, meanwhile, kept his tone measured. He returned to Ottawa without declarations of victory. His message was short: the meetings were productive and dialogue would continue. Yet that restraint spoke volumes. It suggested that Canada no longer played defense. It had learned to turn Trump's tactics into opportunity. As fall deepens, both nations now face a test of endurance. The next phase of talks will decide whether the tariffs remain or evolve into a broader North American energy pact. But one outcome is already visible. The pressure that once cornered Canada has begun to circle back toward the United States. The trade war that started as a show of dominance has become a study in interdependence. And the pipeline that once symbolized division now stands as a reminder that economic strength in North America still runs in both directions. Because in the end, power built on pressure alone never lasts. The handshake in Washington was more than a diplomatic gesture. It was the moment the U.S. realized that leverage cuts both ways.
I think he's a great prime minister. I mean, he could represent me anytime. I will tell you, I'm not saying that because he's here. No, he is a very strong, very good leader.
In Washington, the cameras captured another handshake, another round of smiles inside the Oval Office. President Donald Trump praised his guest, Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the two leaders spoke of friendship and trade. But behind those polite gestures, the stakes could not be higher. For months, Trump's tariffs have tested the economic bond between the United States and Canada. What began as an attempt to force Ottawa into a new deal has now exposed cracks in America's own economy. Factories are slowing down, prices are climbing, and key U.S. states that depend on Canadian energy and materials are feeling the strain. The October 7 meeting between Trump and Carney was meant to reset relations. It ended without a formal deal, yet it marked a quiet turning point. Canada did not yield. Instead, it used patience, economic leverage, and a sense of shared purpose to turn American pressure into a form of power.
Let's be clear about the relationship as it stands right now. We are the second largest trading partner of the United States. We do a lot of trade going across the border. Secondly, we are the largest foreign investor in the United States. $500 billion in the last 5 years alone, probably $8 trillion in the next 5 years if we get the agreement that we expect to get.
Canadian materials are deeply woven into American supply chains. Ontario steel goes into Michigan car frames. Quebec aluminum powers jet parts assembled in Ohio. When the tariffs hit, costs for those same American factories spiked overnight. Construction firms in Texas and Florida reported higher material prices by late summer 2025. Furniture producers in North Carolina warned of job cuts as imported wood components became too expensive to source. Meanwhile, Canadian exports slowed but did not collapse. Many firms shifted their shipments to Europe and Asia under existing trade pacts, while Ottawa cushioned affected sectors with targeted support. By September, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and several Great Lakes governors publicly urged Washington to reconsider. They argued that the tariffs were fueling inflation instead of reducing it. Inside Canada, the mood changed from frustration to resolve. The public saw that Trump's strategy was not breaking Ottawa's will, but exposing America's dependence on cross-border trade. The message became clear: the harder Washington squeezed, the more damage it caused to itself. Unlike the United Kingdom or the European Union, Canada cannot rely on distance to escape American policy shocks. The two nations share the world's longest undefended border, a 9,000-kilometer lifeline through which goods, energy, and investment flow every day. Carney reminded Americans of what that relationship means. Canada is their second-largest trading partner and their single largest foreign investor, with more than $500 billion invested over the past 5 years. If trade tensions ease, those investments could reach $8 trillion within the next 5 years, according to figures discussed by both governments. This level of integration gives Ottawa a different kind of strength. Ontario alone supplies electricity to states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, helping to power factories, hospitals, and homes. When Trump's tariffs raised costs for those same regions, Canadian leaders quietly reminded local governors that their economic stability depends on cooperation, not confrontation. At the same time, Carney's government began shifting incentives toward domestic manufacturing. Companies producing steel and auto parts were encouraged to use off-peak electricity for cheaper power, effectively redirecting energy that once supported U.S. industry. The symbolism was striking. Canada could choose to keep the lights on south of the border, or turn that current inward to strengthen its own factories. Trump wanted leverage, yet geography and integration meant Canada held most of it. While Washington operated in crisis mode, Ottawa projected calm. Carney faced intense domestic pressure to strike a deal, but he resisted the urge to retaliate with sweeping counter-tariffs. Instead, he pulled back Canada's planned digital services tax, a gesture of goodwill that reopened dialogue. This approach contrasted sharply with the mood in the United States. The federal government remained partly shut down due to budget stalemates. Inflation was rising, and investors faced uncertainty over shifting tariff lists. By comparison, Canada's fiscal position was stable. International agencies kept the country's AAA credit rating. Its debt-to-GDP ratio remained the lowest in the G7, and the Bank of Canada maintained steady interest rates even as global markets wavered. The contrast was not lost on financial analysts. Stability had become Canada's best diplomatic weapon. While Trump sought quick wins through public pressure, Carney built credibility quietly, aligning provincial premiers and business groups around a single goal: keep trade channels open and prevent panic. Even conservative figures who opposed Carney politically, such as former Minister Peter MacKay and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, acknowledged that the Prime Minister had to succeed for the sake of the national economy. The consensus was rare, and it strengthened Ottawa's hand. By the time the October meeting concluded, the U.S. and Canada agreed to maintain technical talks and pause further escalation. No one declared victory, yet the silence itself spoke volumes. Carney had managed to turn confrontation into cooperation without conceding sovereignty. At the heart of the standoff lies a truth both sides cannot escape. The two economies are built together. More than 60% of components used in American auto assembly plants originate in Canada, according to North American industry data. Quebec's aluminum and Ontario's steel remain critical inputs for U.S. aviation and construction. When Trump revived his 51st state remark, many Canadians saw it as an insult, but others recognized it as proof of how intertwined the two nations have become. Each tariff, each soundbite only underscored that separation would harm both. This reality reshaped the political landscape in the Great Lakes region. Governors from states like Michigan and Wisconsin, home to millions of workers tied to cross-border trade, openly opposed further tariffs. They called for cooperation on steel, autos, and energy rather than escalation. Canada's strategy was to highlight this shared dependency without turning it into a public feud. Through joint industrial meetings and energy briefings, Ottawa quietly reminded U.S. officials that integrated grids, pipelines, and manufacturing corridors cannot be rebuilt elsewhere without enormous cost. In effect, the North American supply chain itself became Canada's shield. Every car part crossing the Detroit-Windsor Bridge, every megawatt of power flowing south served as living evidence that partnership, not punishment, is the only sustainable model. Trump's tariffs may have been loud, but Canada's integration was louder in practice. When the second Trump-Carney meeting ended, there was no new trade deal to announce, yet Canada walked away stronger than before. It had protected its industries from escalation, rallied bipartisan support at home, and earned sympathy from governors, investors, and even segments of the American business community. The U.S. administration may still hold the tariff lever, but Canada controls something more durable: trust, consistency, and the quiet backing of economic facts. Trump's strategy to pressure Ottawa has instead revealed how dependent Washington remains on its northern neighbor. The story that began as a test of strength is turning into a lesson in interdependence. In the long run, tariffs can be lifted or replaced, but the networks of energy, labor, and investment that bind these two nations cannot be unmade. Trump wanted a headline victory. Carney aimed for endurance. And as the lights of the Great Lakes continue to glow on both sides of the border, it is clear whose approach is keeping them on.
Looking around the world now, you've got China sort of playing by its own playbook economically. You have the U.S. playing by its own playbook, ignoring various agreements, including at times USMCA. What does that mean for the rules-based system for a middle power like Canada?
At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a message that left many in Washington unsettled.
And nobody's perfect in this. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're re-engaging with China and other major economies in terms of developing the rules bilaterally with them.
He announced that Canada would re-engage with China, seeking to establish a new framework for bilateral rules. This declaration landed just as the United States, under President Trump, has extended its reciprocal tariff regime to every major trading partner, including Canada. The tariffs were meant to force others into accepting America's terms. Yet Carney signaled that Canada was ready to chart its own path. Instead of bowing to pressure, Ottawa is turning outward, searching for new alliances and new leverage. The story begins with a clash of visions. Trump builds walls of tariffs. Carney opens doors to alternative partners. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next. Carney made clear that both Washington and Beijing are playing by their own rulebooks. For Canada, that reality means waiting for others to return to multilateral discipline is no longer an option. Ottawa will now attempt to develop direct rules with China, recognizing the risks but also the opportunities of engaging the world's second-largest economy. Sensitive areas such as national security and data privacy will remain closed. Yet Canada intends to carve out a controlled space for trade and cooperation. This is not surrender, but calculation. With Trump escalating confrontation and tariffs disrupting steel, autos, and farm products, Carney has decided that Canada must place a chip on every table. The re-engagement with China is meant to give Ottawa more balance and more say, even if it means moving in a direction opposite to Washington. This step is designed to give Canada breathing room at a time when U.S. trade actions are tightening around all partners. Carney also reminded his audience that Canada already holds positions in two of the world's largest rules-based systems, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. These agreements include standards for labor and sustainability, the kind of provisions that are recognizable and enforceable. By being part of both, Ottawa can serve as a bridge between Europe and Asia. The United States, by contrast, has stepped away. Trump pulled America out of the original TPP and has repeatedly ignored commitments under USMCA. Carney's point was not hidden. Canada is investing in systems where rules matter, while Washington sidelines itself. As those networks expand, America risks becoming the bystander. Ottawa is signaling that its future will not be locked inside Trump's tariff cage. Instead, Canada is building the kind of international bridges that leave Washington outside the room when new rules are written. Carney did not deny Canada's vulnerability. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south into the United States. But he emphasized the importance of what he called the growth at the margin. New trade with Europe, with CPTPP countries, and with China can shift the balance over time. Even small increases in those directions can change the outlook for industries battered by tariffs. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, meant to squeeze, are creating the incentive for Canada to move elsewhere. The backfire is clear. Instead of reinforcing dependence, the policy has accelerated diversification. Canada is showing that it can step out of America's shadow and place itself in the center of a different global map. The contrast could not be sharper. Trump designed his tariff regime to keep Canada in line, but Carney's new approach flips that logic. By re-engaging with China and doubling down on Europe and Asia, Ottawa is no longer asking Washington for permission. Canada is signaling that it has options and that the United States is not the only game in town. This is the image that left Trump stunned, watching as his neighbor quietly walked out of the cage he built. That is why Carney's words in New York carried such weight. Trump sought to lock Canada in. Ottawa has walked out, leaving the U.S. president stunned as his northern neighbor rewrites the script of survival and influence.